guys, welcome back to Nadir Audio. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at the small but really heavy monster right here, the Schiit Vidar Class AB power amplifier. So for a while now I've wanted the ability to switch between a tube amp and a solid state amp in my main system. So tubes for when I'm in the mood to listen to tubes, and solid state for when I'm in the mood for solid state. And for a while now I've been using this little Bayou Raizong A10 integrated tube amp, which I really love, and it works great. And I have it paired up with my main speakers, which are KEF LS50s. Now these speakers are relatively insensitive, but they work with this little 6-watt amplifier a lot better than you might think. They get plenty loud for anything that I want to listen to, so on the tube front I'm pretty much set up. But on the solid state I haven't run across anything that works enough that I'd want to keep it in the system long term. So if you've been watching my channel since the beginning, you may remember that I started out with a little PS Audio Sprout, and I really like the Sprout. Actually, since it was in my main system, I used it in our last house as a 2-channel home theater system with a pair of ELAC B5s, and that worked out great. And in the new house I'm using it in my office as a near field system with an inexpensive pair of Pioneer speakers, and that works out really well too. But with the KEFs, it never quite worked out. There were just two problems really. One is it tended to sound a little bit dry and over analytical with the KEF LS50s. But the bigger problem was just that it had a slightly anemic sound when I was listening to heavier music, you know, like rock music or heavier electronic music. It just wasn't muscular, and it just sounded strange with those styles of music, which didn't work out. Now, I didn't have that problem with the ELACs or any of the other systems. I've tried it, so it was something specific to the KEFs. But I really like the KEFs, and so I wanted to move on and try other amps. And as I mentioned, the A10 works out really well, better than you would expect. But on the solid state side, I tried out briefly. I bought a Emotiva BassX A100. And actually that is currently used in my near field system here in this room that I use for mixing and mastering music, and also for listening to headphones and for some other things. And again, it's paired with the ELAC B5s, and it sounds great. So I really do like that amp, but it wasn't working out really well with the KEF LS50s. It was good. I mean, it sounded passable. It worked better than the Sprout did with these speakers, but it still was missing a little bit of that transparency on the high end and the sort of ambient room and air that I talk about in a lot of my videos. I just wasn't getting that, and I just overall felt that it wasn't quite refined enough of an amplifier to work with the LS50s. And so that's when I decided to recently pick up the Vidar, which is a more expensive amp. It's about $700, so it's comparable to the Sprout in price, but you know, it's just a power amp. It doesn't have all the extra stuff that the Sprout has built into it, and it's a lot more expensive than the Emotiva. It's more than 3 times as expensive. So I thought this would give me an opportunity to maybe get the solid state sound I want with the LS50s. So yeah, let's take a look at some of the stuff I've listened to and how it's worked out so far. So I mentioned in the beginning of the video that the Vidar was smaller than I was expecting. And this is partially because it's hard to determine how big something's going to be just seeing it online. But the other part of it is that it arrived in a rather large box that was also quite heavy. So I was really surprised when I pulled the amp out and it was as small as it was. Now, I'm happy that it was small because it fits really well on my shelves. You can see here that it fits right in, and there's room for another small component as well. Whereas with my tube amp, it takes up the whole shelf, but also it gets a little closer to the top of the next shelf than I'd like. So all in all, I think the size is quite good. It is heavy, but it is relatively small. So before hooking up the Vidar, I did open the case just out of curiosity of what was inside. And outside of the 2 large heat sinks that you can see before you even get it open, we have a really large transformer. We have some healthy looking capacitors here. There's a printed circuit board, there's a few other components, and a bunch of surface mount stuff. But all in all, it's a nice clean design. There's not too much stuff stuffed in here. It's nice to see the big transformer. So I went ahead and put it back together and hooked it up in my system. Okay, so since the Vidar is just a power amplifier and not an integrated like the ones I've been using up till now, the first thing I had to do was to find a preamplifier to work with it. Now, I don't have any dedicated preamplifiers yet, but I do have a few devices that have preamplifiers built into them, so that's what we're starting out with. And the first one I had considered was the preamp built into my Topping E30 DAC here, which I reviewed a few weeks ago. I ruled this out pretty quickly just because then I'd be limited to just digital sources, and I do listen to a lot of vinyl and other analog sources. So the first one that I actually tried out was the preamplifier built into my vintage Mitsubishi DA-R20 receiver here. I was just curious what it would sound like, and also it had been a long time since I used this really nice attenuated volume knob, so I thought that'd be kind of fun. And yeah, it was fun, but it's not a modern sound. It's basically just amplifying the sound of this vintage receiver, which is pleasant if you're into the sound of late 70s, early 80s receivers. But it's missing a lot of resolving power, especially on the high end, and a lot of that ambient room sound and air is gone, and the soundstage is restricted, and it's not really life-size, especially in the height, and so that kind of reduces the realism. It was fun to listen to a lot of stuff, especially recordings from the 80s that I hadn't listened to in a while, but I pretty quickly moved on. And the next one I tried out is the one that's actually still in the system here, which is my Schiit Magni headphone amp from my audio workstation. I've got a few other headphone amps, so it's okay to pull one of them and use it for a while. And yeah, as soon as I plugged this in and tried it out, we got that modern sound back. We got all that resolving power on the high end. We got a lot of room, ambient air, all that stuff. Actually better tone. The sound stage is much better. It's much larger. And so we got something that was more in line with what I was expecting. So for now, I've actually brought the Emotiva BassX A100 amp back into the system so I can do some A-B comparisons with these two, since I think that will be a little bit better than trying to compare it directly against a tube amp, which is kind of a different animal. And so we'll go over that. We will talk about it versus the tube amp a little later in the video. So I have all of my sources are running into the receiver, and then there are two tape line outs that I'm using. One that's going into the Vidar, and the other one right now is going into the Emotiva, but eventually will be going into the tube amp, which is what we're trying to accomplish. Now, I don't have a switch to be able to switch the one amp to the other, to the KEF LS50s here. So what I'm doing is I've just got an extra set of speaker cables here. And so these are just Blue Jeans 10 white cables, not high end, but they're not cheap cables either. They're nice and sturdy. And so I've got them labeled here. So this one's labeled for tubes, which is currently going into the Emotiva, but eventually that'll make it easy to pick up tubes. Now I did consider using a switcher, something like the Duke Audio Little Bear that Cheap Audio Man had reviewed recently. But I'd have to get one of those, and then I'd have to get another pair of these cables. So even though they're not high-end, they're $50 a pop, so that's another $100 added onto that. So for now, we're just going to turn off the amps and then swap the cables and turn them back on anytime that we want to do A-B comparisons. That should work okay for now. Okay, so I started comparing these amps with a couple of vinyl reissues. These are from the Blue Note Classic Vinyl series, and the first of which is Maiden Voyage by Herbie Hancock. Now, I've owned this on CD for a number of years, but I just recently picked up the vinyl copy, and it sounds really phenomenal. So one of the things that I will mention before I get into the details is that I did like the Emotiva with the LS50s a lot better than I did the last time I reviewed it a few months ago. Now, there's a number of reasons why that may be the case. I have done some acoustic treatments in this room, so the sound is a little bit better in the room itself. I have put a lot of hours on the Emotiva in my other rig, so maybe there's been some burn-in. I don't know exactly why, but it did work. It has better synergy than I was thinking it did with the LS50s. But that being said, I do like the Vidar better in pretty much every way, and I'll talk about some specifics on these recordings. So on Maiden Voyage, the first thing that you notice is that the soundstage is the appropriate height on the Vidar, whereas with the Emotiva actually has a really wide soundstage. It's actually a little bit wider than the Vidars, but it's not as deep and it's definitely not as tall. And I think that height really kind of lends to that illusion where you feel like you're in a room with the band, whereas when it's constrained height-wise, it kind of diminishes that effect a little bit, in my opinion. But both of these amps did really well. I will say that it felt like with the Emotiva it was slightly flat. Everything was a little bit more vibrant, and there was a little bit more color with the Vidar. And I think it's a little bit more resolving. I will say that it had better room and air. Now, there's not a ton of that on this particular recording, but I do feel like it also did a little bit better with transients. So on some of the drum things where it gets loud suddenly, it just felt more real. There was a little bit more weight with the Vidar. So I'd say that I definitely like the Vidar better with this recording. It wasn't a subtle difference, but it wasn't as big of a difference as it was on some of the others. So one of the other albums I'm going to talk about, also from the classic vinyl series, is The Big Beat by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. Now in this one, the Vidar was significantly better, and I think what it comes down to is this particular recording is a more spacious recording, so having that additional depth in the background really lends to it feeling life-size. But also just on this one, there is more of that ambient room sound. There's kind of that space around the instruments, and I felt like the Vidar was doing that a lot better. And overall, I just felt like this particular recording, it sounded fine on the Emotiva, but it was just a little bit uptight, whereas I felt on the Vidar, the whole thing could sort of breathe, and I enjoyed this particular recording a lot better with the Vidar. It wasn't bad on the Emotiva. I think that that's something, if I wasn't doing A-B comparisons, I would really still enjoy it, but it was dramatically better on the Vidar. Now, I did listen to a few rock albums as well, so previously the Emotiva had done better with the LS50s than the Sprout had originally. Just the Sprout had sort of an anemic sound with heavier music, rock, heavy electronic music, and the Emotiva does a lot better than that. It has a more muscular sound, and that hasn't changed at all. It did just fine with the music that I was listening to. So one of the things I did listen to was the Pretenders' first album, and I feel like while it was good on the Emotiva, on the Vidar, it actually was a little better because I was getting more detail on the guitars, a little bit more on the drums. The drums sounded a little bit bigger and more real. And the biggest difference was actually just on Chrissie Hynde's voice. It was just kind of more full-bodied. There was more tone there. It worked a little bit better. So this wasn't a dramatic difference. I could listen to this particular recording on either one of these amps with these speakers and it would be just fine, but I did like the Vidar a little bit better. So one other album I listened to was Talk Talk's Laughingstock. So if you're familiar with Talk Talk, you're probably more familiar with their 80s albums, which is sort of electronic pop, and they had a few hits on the radio. This is one of their later recordings. It's not too late. I think it's from the early 90s, 91 or 92. But it's much more ambient, and it's just a very cool record. If you've never checked it out, you definitely should. And so this particular recording actually did very well on both of the amps. And it's not really an audiophile recording, but it's a very good recording. And I felt like both amps were getting most of the detail that I'd want to hear out of it. I do feel like the Vidar did just a little bit better. Everything was a little bit fuller. I think the biggest difference really came down to sort of the ambient sound. Now this recording doesn't have a huge spacious soundstage, but it does have some cool ambient reverb and some other effects, and I think they worked a little bit better on the Vidar. So I listened to a few audiophile recordings as well. So one of them was this Transcending Continents and Memories, which is on the MA Recordings label. If you follow the Audiophiliac and you downloaded the MA Recording Sampler, one of the tracks from this album was on that sampler. But this is a really amazing sounding, natural, just recorded to 2 stereo mics in a really nice sounding room. And it's an amazing recording, and I feel like both amps did pretty well, but you really can tell the difference with the Vidar. You're really getting a lot of those tiny little micro details. And again, this has an amazing room sound and nice air around the instruments. And I feel like the Vidar was doing a lot better with that as well, and also with the tone on some of the instruments. So I think generally the Emotiva did just fine, but the Vidar did really well. So I'm very happy to be able to listen to recordings like this and really enjoy them with the Vidar and the LS50. So I'd say overall, in general, I feel that the Vidar is an excellent pairing with the LS50s. I think it has better synergy with these speakers than anything, including my tube amp. I think the tube amp does a lot better than you might think, but again, you can't get too loud with it. And I do think that it works better in general with the Vidar. So I'm going to keep this as my reference level solid state amp in this, and we're going to keep the LS50s for now. And we're also going to keep the tube amp. Now I may experiment with some other speakers that are maybe more efficient, speakers that are maybe better suited to the tube amp, but for now I can really easily just switch between these two amps. So I will say that why bother having two? Well, I think that, you know, you can get the best of both worlds. So with solid state, of course, you get the really well-defined low end and bass. You get really well-defined and resolving top end. Now the tube amp is great on the top end too, but I'd say that in general the top end's a little bit grainier with it. You do get this excellent sound stage with a lot of precision, although it doesn't have that quite that holographic feel you get with the tubes, which is something you just kind of have to experience, but I really like that sound. And then of course with the tubes, you're just getting, you know, the mid-range to die for. So, you know, female vocals and horns, things like that. The tone is just phenomenal with the tube amp. Now, solid state does really well, and Vidar in particular does really well, but it still can't quite compete in that regard. But of course then the tube amp's a little bit loosey-goosey on the low end, and as I had mentioned, a little grainier on the top end. So it's really just, you know, playing to the strengths of both amps. But I like both these amps a lot, so I think I'm going to keep them both as my reference. One is my reference tube amp, one is my reference solid state. So in upcoming videos we'll try out some other preamps with this, and then we'll be testing out some other gear, and now I can test a particular piece of gear using tube amplification and then also with solid state and compare the differences, which is kind of fun, and that's why I like making these videos. So yeah, I think that's it for this one, guys. So thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you guys all in the next video.